Next, Judy Stern and I are going to talk about business analysis and user experience activities for Matterhorn Agile development. We'd like to encourage this to be open question and answer. If you have any questions about what we're talking about, feel free to bring them up. There's some microphones that I guess will be roaming around the audience because this is being recorded. So just ask someone to pass it to you. Michelle, I think, will be happy to get your microphone. Did you want to say anything else before we start?
No, let's start.
OK. So today, what we're planning to talk to you about is user experience and business analysis, how they're similar, how they're different. Some activities that we expect to be performing in the project, which include research, modeling, testing, and then also talking about Agile practices in a little bit more detail, kind of building on what Adam talked about this morning. So how many of you have some idea in your head of what user experience is? Or is it a new term? So one of the ways you can think about user experience, if you haven't already got something that you think about when you hear it, it's kind of the sum experience of a user interacting with a product. It's not just the user interface. It's kind of the whole experience. So if you think of somebody going to a business and buying something, having a transaction, sitting in a waiting room, all of these things are user experience. And in a software product, it's the same thing. Basically, everything throughout the product influences the user experience. That's not to say that user experience folks are necessarily involved in all of these things, but they are kind of looking at everything as a whole in order to provide the best possible user experience. So some of the adjectives that people use to define them, user experience could be useful, desirable, somebody actually wants to use the product, accessible, that's something we think is important, credible, can you believe what it tells you, findable, can you find the information you need, usable, is it easy to use, that, the word, the thing that so many people have trouble describing. And at the center, is it valuable to me when I use this? So designing for user needs is an important part of user experience. This is all stuff you probably already know, but if you design for user needs, customers are going to be more satisfied. Users can be more productive, efficient, and accurate. And one of the really important things, I think, for Matterhorn is it can help increase service and site adoption. So getting people on board, building this community, it's something we're all really concerned about. So coming out with a product that people can actually use should be first and foremost on our mind. In an enterprise, decreased support and training costs, and reduced development time and costs, which, again, we're all kind of under the gun here in this year one. So whatever we can do to figure out what is the package that will be most useful to people, I think will really help us. User needs assessment, customer needs assessment, stakeholder needs assessment. It can kind of all go under this heading. But we want to understand who these people are who have a concern about the application. What are their goals, especially from the user standpoint? Why would people be using the application? We don't necessarily want to know what specific tasks are you performing today, because we don't necessarily want to replicate it exactly. But what are the high-level goals? How can we help you do it better? What are the pain points you're having? So, I think you all probably have pain points in your current systems that you can think of right off the bat. How can we make this better? We use a variety of techniques to gather this information: interviews, contextual inquiries, observations, surveys. All of these things will help drive the design of the system. So business analysis, that's another concept that's important in this project. I'm the business analyst lead. So in a traditional sense, often business analysis is thought of as a lot of the same things that user experience folks do: requirements analysis and definition, process modeling, analysis, and improvement. And I have business in parentheses here because it's not everything. Everything is a business process, and it's also many of them also affect users. So it's just kind of like different views into the same space. And then systems analysis and design. So again, these are kind of similar things to what the user experience person does. Maybe the business analyst is more focused on data-centric design, object design, that sort of thing, as opposed to user interface design. But both are concerned with both angles. There's business process modeling involving a lot of different diagrams and methodologies. But using a particular diagram doesn't mean you have a methodology. So we kind of have to think for Matterhorn what is going to help us get to our goals most efficiently, and kind of pick and choose from the different models that are out there. So how are business process or business analysis and user experience related? Both are right out there in the front as the project kicks off, helping define and refine business goals. So why are we doing this? You know, what's the return on investment? Why are we creating this product? Both talk to interested parties, various different types of interested parties, to understand their needs and goals, whether they be users of the system, business stakeholders, potential customers. Both gather and define requirements. And both have different tools for documenting current processes, as well as think about how to improve these processes. And although some people might perceive business analysis as more focused on the business and user experience design is more focused on the user, you know, as I've said, we're both thinking of the needs and goals of all the people involved in the system, and we really do think it makes sense to approach them in a unified fashion in this project. So we've seen user experience and business analysis split on some projects, like Kuali Student. And what we found is they're both doing similar activities, and they could be leveraging each other's work. But because they were such separate teams, they didn't have that opportunity. Also, they were very large teams in a very large project. So Judy and I, our philosophy from the beginning is to approach it in kind of a unified way. So again, as I said, the Matterhorn BA UX team we see as a unified team working together, a cross-project resource, you know, available to help advise, you know, help direct, help figure out goals for all of the different areas of the project. We want to really help the Matterhorn team understand and design for user and business needs, both very important, and you know, to design the system that we hope those out there will adopt. So who is the Matterhorn BA UX team? My goodness, it's probably all of us in some way or another. I think we're all going to be, you know, doing some use case gathering, some requirements, documentation, all of these things, potentially even service modeling, which I think was actually on the previous slide that I didn't bring up. That's also potentially what we see as a part of business analysis. So far, we've kind of identified a few people that are probably going to be in this area, Judy and I, of course. Marcus and Clemens from Osnabrück, Olaf from Zurich, Martin from Indiana, and Josep and Alicia from Catalonia. So who are we missing? Who else can see themselves performing any of these types of activities on the project? And I do just also want to say that one of the things we'd like to do, you know, we really want to make sure that we understand. We've been talking with these boxes about who our potential target customers are, hoping to kind of coalesce on a shared vision. And I think we really do want to understand those initial adopters out there and what their needs are. So we're hoping, Judy and I have done a contextual inquiry, which Judy will talk about, with a local college. And we hope that others can kind of go out there and talk with other people and potentially pick up on some other important things that we can incorporate into the design. I don't know, do any of you want to say, oh yeah, that sounds really like me, or that sounds not like me, get me off that list? Yeah. Pardon? Great, fantastic. And you know, volunteers, other people that aren't here today, we definitely would love to get anyone involved in this. You know, Judy and I can kind of provide some guidance in getting people out there and helping gather this information and then create models from it, which will help us with our design. This is you.
Can people hear me? Yes. And so one thing I want to say to follow up on Allison is it doesn't have to be a huge commitment. If somebody's willing to spend, you know, half an hour or so interviewing somebody who's local to you, that could help us. So we're going to keep pushing on that. We're not just accepting all the blank stares. So kind of an important thing that Allison touched on is that it's really important to understand business and user needs. And that's what we see as a very large part of what we're doing. And so there's kind of three major areas that we're thinking of as the ways that we are going to make sure that we understand business and user needs. So there's research, which Allison has talked about a little bit, that we're focusing on stakeholders, we're focusing on users. I should have said customers there as well, and their tasks, the things they need to do, and their goals, why they're doing them. There's modeling, so we'll talk a bunch more about different ways that we model, but you know, what's a model? It's basically some kind of representation, usually visual, of our current understanding of a concept, and there's all sorts of models that Allison is actually going to share with us. And then testing. There's two types of testing that we see this group being involved in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So let's talk first about research, kind of the primary research techniques that we see being used on Matterhorn. And I want to say this is, kind of what Allison and I are proposing, and we're certainly open to other suggestions. Surveys, stakeholder and customer interviews, and contextual inquiries with users. This is a quote from Kim Goodwin, who is from Cooper, which is kind of a major interaction design firm, who really pushes on the research aspect of things, because a lot of people think, oh, we don't need to do research, we already understand our customers. And one of her points is that not only is it important to do to make sure you understand your customers, but it can also at times speed up the decision-making process, because you're not spending a lot of time discussing what you think the user needs or the customer needs. You've got some data to go with. And once again, we're on a short timeline here, and we need to do whatever we can to speed up those decision-making processes. So one of the forms of research, and it's one that we think is kind of limited but useful in a way, is surveys. So Adam put out a survey a month or so ago, who is the Opencast community that's starting to get at some of that information. We got 54 responses, not awesome, but not so bad. And just a couple of interesting points to us is that a large number say that it'll be IT professionals who will be responsible for deployment. That's good to know that, that most of these institutions who are interested have IT professionals that they'd be able to dedicate to deployment. Of course, it raises more questions than answers. Who are these people? What's their skill set? And we know that, we're going to need to dive into that further. Over half of the institutions said that they restrict recordings to a course's students. And that also tells us something about who our potential customers are. And again, more questions. Why is that? Is it because of policy? Is it just because of history? So we want to find out more about that. Interviews are useful, particularly with stakeholders and customers, and I'm kind of lumping them together. On many projects, stakeholders are different than customers. On our project, most of us actually serve, or most of you serve, as both the stakeholders, the people who make a difference as to how successful this project is, as well as the people who will buy it or adopt it. Of course, there are plenty of other customers that we need to interview as well. The kinds of things that we need to find out from our stakeholders and customers are, what is success, and what's the worst thing that could happen on the project, as well as kind of more nitty-gritty, how the organization works, who users are, and what systems and processes and policies are already in place. So kind of really understanding the ecosystem that anything we build has to fit into. Contextual inquiry is a term that many of you are probably not familiar with. It's useful to think of it as kind of combined interview and observation. And what's important about it is that it's conducted in the context of where the work happens. So you don't want to, bring people to a big empty room and try and do this. You want to go to their office where you see, all the artifacts that they're using, the fact that, they have to keep looking things up on paper, and they're using 3 different computers, and what that environment really is like. And so it combines the strengths of both interview and observation. It also puts it kind of in the middle, whereas with interviews, the process is kind of run by the person doing the interview, which would be the designers. With observation, the process is influenced more by the person who, you just kind of let them do their thing and you follow. And contextual inquiry is kind of in the middle. So it's a show and tell where you have the user kind of do their stuff and talk about it to you. And one way to introduce it is to think of it as a master-apprentice relationship, where you, the observer, are kind of letting the user teach you what they do. And there's a lot of good information that comes out of that. So as Allison mentioned, we recently did a contextual inquiry with a local institution. And what it really was we did kind of the customer interview first. We had a bunch of folks in the room at various levels of the hierarchy, as well as kind of one of the primary users. So we talked and did that interview first, and then we moved on to do more of a contextual inquiry with the user. But it was interesting in that in the interview portion, integration with registrar data was not something that came up as important to any of them. You know, they kind of mentioned it in passing. And nor on their survey, on the Matterhorn survey, did they mark that it was something that was missing. And yet, when we did our observations, it became clear that it was a pretty big deal. There was a lot of manual copy and paste going on over and over again to get that registrar data into the system, incredibly labor intensive, and also error prone. So we heard about an example where the wrong course got recorded, and depending on who it was, that could be a really big deal. So, you know, this is just, you know, one of the kinds of things that you see in contextual inquiry. And it's why we want to continue to do this throughout the project. Once again, you know, we need to do research. We need your help. It's important for all of us to avoid what's called self-referential design, where you think you understand what somebody else needs because you know what you need. And so we need your help because there is a diversity of experiences, not only kind of geographically based, but institution size and all the other variables that we can think of. So this week, actually, Allison and I hope to be able to grab at least some of you and do some stakeholder interviews to go into a little bit more depth about what you're doing at your institution. Over the next 2 months, we hope to do more and engage some of you in helping with that. So in this iteration 0 period that Adam has referred to. And then throughout the year, research doesn't just stop once we start developing. That's kind of the waterfall model where all the research gets done and then you're done. We're going to continue doing research, not at, you know, kind of a big formal level, but enough to answer the questions that we need to keep on moving. So Allison's going to jump in and talk about modeling.
Okay, so there are a lot of different types of models that we might use in this project. Some are more drawn on user experience, some are drawn on business analysis. So I'm just going to kind of run through them at a high level. And, you know, what really is a model? So, you know, we, as I said, use all sorts of different types of models. But in general, they can consolidate complex information into some sort of easy to remember abstraction, whether it's a persona that represents the types of users that you're going to be designing for, or a use case which represents a standard workflow that you expect to be designing for. Because remembering and making sense of all the raw data when you go out and talk to people or you gather requirements from all of the stakeholders would be impossible. So we create these models to kind of help us in our design process. So as I said, help us make sense of and find patterns in findings. And also a really important thing is it helps us gain consensus about the problem, the target users, who are we designing for, what are we designing, a lot of the things we've been talking about today in the design the box exercise. So we want to do this early on before any design and development happens. And this also provides a shared language and vision so that we can all kind of say, yes, this is what we're working towards, these are who we're designing for, these are kind of the major use cases that we're thinking about. So I mentioned personas. It's an archetype. A user, basically kind of a description with a picture. Here's an example here. On the Fluid project, we did a series of contextual inquiries where we came up with a set of personas kind of for higher ed for whom we were designing Fluid components for. You know, there's some background about the person. We have kind of a main high-level point section, their goals, their frustrations and pain points, a description. The whole idea is to make this person come alive. So that we can avoid self-referential design. We have a focal point for who we're designing for. Personas provide focus, they provide empathy. We can empathize with this person and what they're going through. Gaining consensus, we all know who we're designing for, and avoiding the elastic user who stretches to fit whatever we think. Oh yes, our students are very smart. They don't need any sort of tutorial. Or oh, our students just need to be walked through this. They need a wizard to step them through this process. So personas really concretize who we're designing for. Mental models are another technique to kind of understand how users think about a system. Use cases and scenarios. I'm going to talk about use cases in a minute, but a scenario is kind of a descriptive story about how a user experiences a system. We have activity and workflow diagrams, which is more of a graphical representation of a workflow through a system. UML has a lot of these types of things. Use case diagrams are another kind of potential diagram format. Swim lane diagrams, if you have multiple users in a system that are users and system parts, actors, all of these different actors that are involved in a workflow, you can have swim lanes that kind of show how the process moves between the different actors. Entity relation diagrams, things that we want to understand how all the different entities in our systems interact with each other, not just for database design. User stories, again, that's a concept that Adam introduced this morning, and we think it's going to be very important in our Agile design and development process. And finally, service models. So I'm going to show you an example of what Kuali Student and Collection Space here on campus are using to model their services, kind of documenting it in a wiki. So in terms of our persona hypothesis for Matterhorn, Judy's already hinted at this a little bit. Way back when, I understand that you guys all brainstormed all of the different roles that might be involved in Matterhorn. But we think it's important to kind of focus our efforts on certain types of users that we think are going to be key to adoption or key users of the system. And the first one we think is going to be the configurer. Might be described as moderately technical system administrator, primarily involved with installation and potentially troubleshooting. May not require a graphical user interface, but that doesn't mean they don't have a user interface. Even if they have to deal with an XML file that configures the system, that's an interface. So we as user experience designers are thinking about all the kinds of interfaces and all the needs of the users who might be using them. So again, this is a persona hypothesis, subject to change. It's just kind of our initial thoughts from the research and the requirements that have been gathered so far. But this will be an ongoing conversation, I expect, within the BA UX group.
And let me add that it's also the year one scope.
That's right.
There are definitely other people that we think we will serve beyond year one, but right now we're kind of focusing on year one.
Definitely. So, and also in year one, the administrator is going to be a very important person who's running the system, capturing the lectures, doing any sort of editing, any distribution activities. And then the learner. We definitely want to focus on what they're doing with the media when it comes out of the system and make sure that we understand those needs. If we have a very minimal player in year one, we may want to do more research in the second year. This is all still kind of to be determined, but we do think the learner is a key person to focus on. One of the user types we're not going to focus on is the instructor. Although we do have one story card, I think, that mentions an instructor having to press start and stop for the lecture capture. We don't anticipate them being very involved in year one, so that might be more of a year two thing in understanding instructor needs. So moving on to use cases. How many of you have used use cases in your work before? A few? Quite a few. OK. So there are many different formats of use cases, and I've seen the wide range in the Kuali and Collection Space project from very structured, lengthy in Kuali Student to in Collection Space, which again are these, I should mention, these are the two open source projects on campus that are doing services-based design and development. So we've kind of been looking at them as potential examples of how to do our service design, service modeling. So we've been looking at kind of how they've used use cases, how that is fed into the service design process. And I'll show you some examples. They, again, wide-ranging from different levels of granularity. But use cases, a couple of definitions here. Simply stated, allow description of sequences of events that taken together lead to the system doing something useful. So a workflow. Another definition is a sequence of actions that takes place in a problem domain between a user and the system. So here's one potential use case format. Again, this is the lengthier format. Might have a name, description, actors, preconditions, triggers, a main success flow, alternate flow, post conditions, assumptions, and then just kind of issues and notes in the end. And here's an example of that in Kuali Student. They have a large database of use cases, and they're very well spelled out. They're trying to address the needs of student systems in multiple institutions. Their idea is to come out with an enterprise-wide student system, which can be used anywhere. So all of the partner schools are kind of bringing in their requirements, and they're trying to design the system to address all of them. So it's a very large project, very complicated, and that has affected the way they do their service modeling, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. On the other hand, here's a use case from Collection Space. Collection Space is an open source collections management application It has a much smaller scope than Kuali Student, so I think it's more in line with what we're doing. I feel that they're more of a services-based application development project, which I think is in line with what we're doing. We'll talk a little bit about what the difference might be between that and big SOA at our training tomorrow. So it's just simply a narrative. You could also even maybe call this a long scenario. So I guess my hypothesis is that our use cases will probably be a little bit less rigorous. They may be more along the lines of collection space. However, in certain areas, if we find we need to get in a lot more detail, we can leverage the lengthier use case format. And whether or not we even use use cases is kind of a question. Use cases can definitely, as we go around, we're talking to all these different user types. We're gathering use cases. We're saying, OK, these are things, these are patterns we're seeing. People are doing these. These are typical workflows in the system. Let's document them as use cases. Those feed very nicely into user stories. So it's up to us, really, to decide at what level we need a use case that goes to a user story and when we can go directly to a user story. So this is something we'll be thinking about and evolving our methodology throughout the project. So service modeling. This is something that is new to me, so I'm learning. I'm kind of out there talking with Collection Space and Kuali Student about exactly the process that they're using to approach this. This is kind of the documentation standard that both of them are using. I have links to all of this in this presentation, and if there's somewhere for me to post this presentation afterward, you guys can check out the links to all these different documents. Actually, let me just tell you, well, we're being recorded. There's a user ID and password that I'm not supposed to distribute too widely, so maybe I'll wait till the recording's off and then give that to you for the Kuali Student Wiki. But yeah, so this is an example of how they're modeling their services. There's a bit more to it than that, but I'm not going to go into that detail now. I think I'll save that for kind of around our SOA training. But the interesting thing about this is they document everything. They document all the operations, the service, description of the service, included services. All of this is documented in the wiki, and then they have a spider that goes in, and maybe Josh can help me with this, that kind of grabs all of this information and I believe transfers it to a Java object, which is then created into a WSDL. OK. So I view my expertise, as more of the modeling end of service design and development. So then I kind of hand it off to Josh and the other architects to kind of figure out technically how it happens. But we're still not even sure. We think we may want to document our services in the wiki this way, also be creating services in Java on the side. Which one goes first, we're not really sure yet. This is kind of an evolving process which we're thinking about. Collection Space uses the same model. However, they have a very different approach to services. They did not, and in fact, I think I have a better slide for this. They did not do a lot of upfront modeling. They're kind of basically defining all of the different entities in their domain and simply adding CRUD operations. So their service description here simply would be like a description of the entity, related entities, I think, as well, and just CRUD operations. They're going to just start with create, R, update, delete. What's R? Read. Yes, Adam? An entity. That's a very good question. So right now, I think it's kind of the high-level nouns in our project, the things that we think will be talking to each other. And then the verbs are kind of the capabilities, the operations, the services, or I'm sorry, the service methods that will be how these entities talk with each other. And here, thank you for bringing that up, is an entity model that Kuali created. So again, in the beginning of the project, they did a lot of upfront modeling. They kind of thought really deeply about all the different entities in the project. They have this concept of a learning unit, which is kind of like a course, or it could be anything that's kind of put together into a format that the student can take away learning from. I guess an independent study, all kinds of different concepts. They have learning units. They have things in the financial aid area. They basically split it up into a bunch of different domains. And I think that is analogous to our capture, processing, distribution, and engage. So we've kind of already separated things up into different domains. And then within those domains, what are the entities that are going to be talking to each other? Does anyone have some ideas? What are the big things that are going to be out there? There's going to be some encoding done. Yes?
Yeah, you can take any one of the simple user stories from the cards or things that we all know about, like the user wants to bookmark some
Very object-oriented. Of course.
Right, well, that's
absolutely.
An interesting edge case where it might be part of some metadata, but it's not really part of our core, it's an interesting problem. I don't think of us modeling courses here, in Matterhorn. I may be, there would be disagreement there, but I see a course as just a particular type of metadata.
It may be. I think that all remains to be determined. So that's one of, I think, the early activities that we hope to do in iteration 0 is some thinking about the high-level entities and how they might interact with each other on a high level. Something like this. This is their organization data entity diagram. Then they got more detailed and added all of the different metadata underneath each different type. They had a data team, this is Kuali Student again, and they decided they were doing too much upfront database design and disbanded them. So I think this is an example of the level of detail that we will not get to initially. We're trying to think more at a high level, at a kind of service-oriented level, and not at a data level. And again, we'll talk more about this tomorrow in our SOA training. Other ideas for entities or questions?
I've got a question about data modeling. Okay, I've got a question about data modeling and Agile. Because this comes back to almost some of the first topics that we talked about today, what Agile isn't. I mean, one of them was an excuse not to think about what you're doing or an excuse not to document. But one of the problems with data modeling is one of the goals of data modeling is you're trying to get a broad view of how everything works together and then drill down and see the interconnections. With Agile, it seems a little harder to do this. How do we find the happy medium? Agile is more, find your problems as you're doing them and then kind of run into these. Where do we make sure that we're not over-modeling or under-modeling as we go through things?
Thank you, Chris, for setting up my next slide. Basically, Kuali Student and Collection Space have taken differing approaches to this. And the collection space model is the more agile model. So Kuali Student, model everything up front, big design up front, lots of data modeling, which they figured out was too much. Start with the entities, add all possible service operations, have a really lengthy service document that has every possible thing a service can do. Collection space, on the other hand, defined only the high-level entities. As I said, added the CRUD operations to them. But their philosophy is to be agile, is to add operations to the services as needed, as kind of Patrick Schmidt's, the tech lead for the project, or the services lead, explained to me, it's like putting layers on an onion is how he sees it. So start out with the most basic description of a service, and as needs are discovered, add to it. Now there's a balance, of course, because you do have to have the high-level view in order to create reusable services that cross different entities, different projects. So it's going to be, I think we're going to get a little bit of this tomorrow with the SOA training. They have a top-down and a bottom-up approach, approaching it both from use cases is what they call the top-down approach, and from the bottom-up APIs for things that we'll want to connect to. But I think even beyond that, we step back a little bit, and we're going to try to have to understand, as I said, these different entities that are important to our project. And that is in itself going to have to be agile. It's going to be a hypothesis, and we'll have to kind of iterate on it through our iterations. Do you have something to add? No, please do.
Hi. And Chris, if we find like a month into the project that we're just treading water and we need to do more modeling, then we'll do that. An agile approach is also acknowledging what the problems are and then changing your approach. So, I think that, and you will also have the freedom within your own project to structure it the way that you would like to, because in some ways the projects are independent. One of the myths with Agile is that the architecture just unfolds. There's no architectural decisions made up front, and realistically in our project, that's one example of where we're going to have to come to those conclusions a lot earlier. So it's just, things aren't perfect. It's about getting it done.
And I just wanted to add. I also just Hello, there it is. I also just wanted to add that, I think when we talk about modeling, we should really be careful that we're talking about doing service modeling, so modeling what maybe the XML entity might look like, but not necessarily how that is persisted. Database models I think would be completely out of scope, because how, for instance, if one particular team is in charge of some service, how they do their data storage should not be anyone else's concern. So whether they're storing it in a hierarchical database or relational database or what have you, but really we're talking about how the representations get passed back and forth between the services.
Which is, I think, one of the reasons why Kuali said too much database design is happening. They made that exact same point to me, that the way it's represented in the service or the entities may not match the database because it might not be the most efficient way to create the database. So definitely different things. Thanks for bringing that up.
Hello. We'll also have an opportunity, and I think Josh's workshop is going to kick this off in terms of talking about different persistence strategies and how, if we need to align on that across projects in terms of the databases we use and so forth. And so there will be opportunity this week to discuss that.
Other comments, questions? We'll definitely be continuing this discussion throughout the week. It's something that I hope to evolve, and a methodology I hope to learn from all of you if you have any experience that would help us kind of think about how we want to approach this. So the other points that I didn't address here is Kuali Student has an application design team who basically their entire purpose is to test the services by writing pseudocode to see if they can use them, because it's very hard for them. They're not designing a concrete application like we are, like collection spaces. It's very conceptual at this point, and each individual institution will have their own implementation of the services. So they decided to create something called Kuali Reference University, which is their focal point. So they're trying to understand, okay, if I were Kuali Reference University, how would I use these services? And that's helping them vet them. I anticipate in this project our services are going to be vetted as we integrate them into our bits and pieces ourselves. Also, the other important point about collection space, their Agile approach is that nothing is guaranteed to stay the same. They don't guarantee any backwards compatibility in their service models before version 1.0. Once version 1.0 comes out, they're going to be thinking about this. So we'll have to think about these same questions for ourselves. And on to Judy.
Okay. So we said we were going to talk about research, modeling, and testing. So we're on to the testing part. And as I mentioned, there's basically two types of testing that we see the UX BA team responsible for: usability testing and acceptance testing. Usability testing, the basic question we're asking is how well can users use it? That is our sole responsibility, whereas acceptance testing, which relates to story cards and user stories, the question here is, has the user story been correctly implemented? There should be a question mark at the end of that. And that we see primarily as being the job of the project managers on each team, but the UX-BA team will help. And given that in some cases the project managers are on the UX-BA team, it all gets mixed up. And we're hoping acceptance tests are kind of a really big part of user stories, and I think we're planning to get to them later in the week. We'll actually be writing a bunch of acceptance tests, so we know what we're testing. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the research, the modeling, and the testing, and how it all fits into kind of this whole Agile world and our different iterations. So this is largely from the perspective of the UX-BA team, which is why the circles on the bottom are bigger than the circles on the top. It doesn't mean that the circles on the top are as smaller or less important or anything like that, but it's from our perspective. And the circles on the top are much less complete. So there's stuff that's going to be going on in iteration 0 for both the developers and for us. And some of what we see us doing is, some of that research and modeling, trying to understand high-level needs, as well as what's going to be happening in early iterations. Yep.
I was just going to ask, do you see iteration 0 as everything up until July?
That's what I was seeing it as. Do you see it differently?
No, I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page.
Thanks. So then we move on to iteration 1, which is when the project officially starts. And we hope that at that point, developers will be implementing the iteration 1 user stories. At that time, the UX BA team is going to be supporting iteration 1, so lots of back and forth. That's key to Agile. Also, we'll be thinking about designing for iteration 2, because that's the next thing the developers are going to be working on, as well as thinking ahead, is there research or modeling that we need to be doing that's specific to stuff that we anticipate coming up in iteration 3. And so maybe this is a point in time to say, the amount of detail that we expect to know about each iteration is less the further out we are. So hopefully, I think our goal for this week is to know pretty close to what iteration 1 is going to be, less so about iteration 2, even less so about iteration 3, et cetera. When it comes to iteration 2, when the developers are working on the iteration 2 stuff, our team will be testing what came out of iteration 1, supporting what's going on in iteration 2, designing for iteration 3, and again, thinking ahead 2 iterations to what's going on in iteration 4. So, and so on and so on. So, again, in a waterfall, space, the research and modeling would happen up front, then all the development, and at the end, all the testing. And that's not what we want to happen. We want this all to be interwoven. And one thing to point out is that that it's been successful for some UX teams to do the research and modeling at the same time as some of the usability testing. So actually using one person and trying to understand what their needs are at the same time as actually testing what code has been implemented already. So some kind of quick ways that are not resource intensive to get the information that we need. So coming back to some of the concepts that came up this morning with Adam that are particularly important to us, there's the concept of the product owner. In some Agile worlds, it's called the customer. And the role of this person is basically to act as the voice of the customer and the user, and their main responsibility is to prioritize the product backlog. The product backlog, as a reminder, is a prioritized list of all the functionality that's supposed to be in the product. And there's product backlogs, there's release backlogs, there's iteration backlogs. But thinking in terms of the whole product, which is what we're doing today, we're kind of staying with the theme of today being our product vision day. We're going to think at the level of product backlog. Later on in the week, we're going to move on to thinking about release and iteration. And then user story, again, basically it describes the functionality that's going to be valuable to the user or the customer. I want to say a little bit more about the product owner. That in some Agile projects is an individual, but more often it's a team, which usually consists of project managers as well as UX people, business analysts. And I think that's largely how we're seeing it, that it's primarily the project managers along with those of us on the UX BA team, as well as getting input from everybody, because again, we're in an interesting project where people who are developers are actually also users or customers or stakeholders, and so there's a lot of overlap. But we still want to make sure that product owner responsibility gets taken care of. Who's got a question?
Yeah, I have a question regarding the product owner. Is that entity identical with the persona we were talking about just shortly ago? In the context of the business analysis?
The persona is an archetype of the user. So oftentimes you want on your product owner team one of your users when that can happen. Because the goal of the product owner is to act as the voice of the user. If you actually have a user on the team, that would be great. And we're going to have to see how that balances out. But a persona is a representation, a model of the user that you use when you're designing. And that comes out of the user experience world. And the concept of product owner is very specifically coming out of the Agile world.
I did understand that, and I think the question is more concrete when it comes to the question of inclusion of the teacher, because you excluded the teachers when you talked about personas and entities there, which is fine by me. The question is whether that is fine here as well in that context, because I could imagine teachers having a say in prioritizing certain aspects of the backlog.
That's an interesting, I mean, remember, you know, we excluded the instructor only for purposes of scope for year one, saying that's not who we're going to focus on. But yeah, you're right, that having the voice of the instructor as a future user could be very important. I mean, we're in a really interesting space here, right, where we've got this kind of somewhat artificial scope of what we have to deliver in a year. And yet at the same time, we want to be knowing that what we're building is going to take us into the future. So, yeah, looking ahead. So it may well be worth our while to make sure that even though we're not modeling an instructor, we're not building a persona for them, that their voice is heard. And that it may be worth it having them on the product owner team or thinking about that.
Yeah, we in terms of the Opencast community, I found it interesting of those who submitted a survey, completed the survey, that only a very few of them were actually faculty. So I think that what one would find in terms of the Opencast community, that maybe faculty are on the present, they're just not representing themselves on lists. So, you know, I would see that the BA UX team would do some outreach and find in terms of a functional advisory, a teacher, professor, or instructor. I think that you're basically taking a lot of information and you're assimilating it, and in terms of the day-to-day having to rank that product backlog, you're doing the best you can incorporating these various inputs from all these places. But I think that the project manager will have a sense as to what the facts are on the ground, and hopefully have a sense as to what kind of coherent product we can move forward with in a year's time. So it's going to be a mixture of a bunch of different things, and it's just, you're going to be making a lot of judgment calls as you're moving forward.
And I also want to say that, you know, that exclusion of the instructor is, as Allison said, our hypothesis, you know, what we see as most significant for year one. But, you know, none of this is cut in stone. So is there another question?
Another quick question. Well, first, I'm a little concerned about that exclusion of the professors, by the way. But I would like to say, as a user, you mean the end user, the student, or you also have there the role of the administrator of the system?
Both. We had three users hypothesized: the configurer or installer, the administrator, who we see as more the day-to-day person, and then yes, the learners, you know, engaging with the media at the end. So. Adam is feeding me something.
just one additional question. What makes you differentiate between the configurer and the administrator?
Because hypothesizing that even though we all wrote on our boxes that this is going to be easy to install and configure, we're not positive that it's going to be, and it seems likely, again, open to discussion, that person will have to, will likely be kind of more of an advanced IT person rather than kind of an on-the-ground level day-to-day operator. So again, a hypothesis, you know, that we can explore further. It's kind of the patterns we've seen out there.
Can we actually differentiate by calling it a system administrator and a program administrator?
Sure.
I mean, because really you're talking about somebody who is when you're talking about the program administrator, somebody who is making sure that professors are signing up, that the metadata that's in the whatever's being distributed is accurate, so the course description, things like that.
Right.
Whereas a systems administrator is somebody who's really managing the server box or something like that.
Yes.
And this might include that we sort of move away from the technical, from the IT sphere into the sphere of where the decision makers might be. Because that is something that I thought was missing as well, that we take the perspective of those people who will take the decision upon actually purchasing our product in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So that's a crucial person for us to gather data about, not necessarily to model. So the people that we're modeling are the people who will be interacting with the system, whereas I think the person you're talking about is unlikely to be touching the system directly.
Yeah, well, he's only buying it, so.
Right.
Well,
which is huge. Yeah.
There is a concept of a customer persona. I think mine's on. Okay. And that is, in some large projects, that's modeled as well. Especially if you're really concerned with, adoption, you may want to spend the time going out and talking to all your potential customers and creating a model.
We're not concerned with adoption anymore.
We just, I mean, for expediency's sake, we're kind of guessing that might not be one that we'll concentrate too much on. But again, we will get some of that information in these contextual inquiries and interviews.
Just an aside too, Mellon, from their perspective, feel like a moderately technical system administrator would need to be able to set this up. And I use myself as a litmus test. If I can set it up, anyone can set it up. So we'll be using me as a tester.
I don't know about that. Okay, so ready to move on? Okay. Go into a little more depth about user stories. And I just want to say as an aside that I hate the term user story because they're not only necessarily about users, and they're horrible stories. You never want to tell them to your kids at bedtime or anything like that. They're really just a statement about what a user needs to do. But we're going to continue to use that term since it's used pretty broadly in the Agile world and now starting to be used in the user experience world. So one key point about user stories is that they kind of serve two purposes that often in software development are not served by the same thing. They're both a way of understanding features. So they form a requirements list in essence. And at the same time, they're a way of defining development tasks. So they're a planning tool. And this kind of makes them somewhat special because they do have these dual purposes. Some people argue that they're not the strongest thing to use for either of those, but they work. And again, in our environment where we've got to move kind of quickly, they seem to be a good model to use. And I do want to say something about tasks because I know that's going to get a little bit confusing because the user stories themselves are about user tasks, things that users do. And then we also have development tasks, which are the things that the developers do. So actually, one of the things that Allison and I are going to be trying to do over the week is help build our Matterhorn glossary. And that's like an example of one of the things that we kind of are going to need to be clear about as we move on. So anyways, that was an aside. And about development tasks, essentially what's going to happen is the user stories are going to later get broken down into development tasks, which will show up in Jira, which is what Adam showed us a little bit about this morning, and Greenhopper. A little bit more about user stories. Again, Adam started to get into this morning. They essentially include 3 parts. There's the story itself. We'll talk about more of what a good story is. Details, that are things that you kind of need to remember as you move on. And then the acceptance tests. And again, acceptance tests are a really big part, and we're going to start writing them later in the week. The story, one kind of structure for the story that people seem to really like, and we're finding we like it here too, is as some kind of user, I need to do some kind of tasks so that I can achieve a goal or because of some reason. And we mentioned in the morning that we've already done a bunch of story writing, or at least some of us, those of us who have been at previous Matterhorn meetings. The part that's new is the "so that I can accomplish something." And when I said we really like it, what has happened is that those initial user stories that were written at the various Opencast meetings that we had over the last year and a half were taken and somewhat synthesized by Michelle, and then translated and filtered by Adam in order to come up with that list that went into the proposal. And so we now have a stack of story cards that are already written. Does somebody know where they are? Okay, as long as somebody knows where we are, because we're going to need them in a minute. So we have things in that form, and what we've done over the last week or so, Adam and Allison and Michelle and I, is write all those "so that's" to the best of our ability. So we're going to be sharing those with you. The thing that Adam credited me with this morning, and I don't actually know who the right person is to credit with, but the idea of a story card is that they're only representative of a collaboration between the product owner and the developer. It's a promise of a conversation. So every single thing down to the T does not go onto a story card. There are various techniques for gathering user stories. So there's interviews, observations, we've talked about that. Questionnaires can be helpful at times. They can be extracted from use cases when you already have use cases. And there are these things called called story writing workshops. And as I said, we've already done our story writing workshops. We didn't call them story writing at the time. We didn't use the term user stories, but we started to think about what this system needs to do. And so what we're going to move on to now, since the story writing has already been done, is something called story mapping, which is a way to prioritize the product backlog. And I've quoted Jeff Patton here. Jeff Patton is somebody who's been working in the Agile world for quite a while, coming up with techniques that incorporate user experience aspects and business analysis aspects. So this is his methodology for prioritizing the product backlog. And he says the story map shows a single view of the entire system that's valuable for forming an incremental release strategy, which is exactly what we need to do. And we're going to kind of iterate on this throughout the week. We're going to start today by doing some story mapping to get kind of a loose sense of priority, and we'll get narrower and narrower and down to the release and then the iteration level as we get through the week. So kind of graphically, what story mapping looks like is we're going to start with a horizontal axis that represents time. And along time, we put kind of the major activities that go into the thing that has to be done. For us, they map pretty well to the main phases that have been laid out in the proposal: prepare, capture, process, and engage. And then we have a vertical axis, which is criticality, what absolutely has to get done. And we're going to be taking the cards that Michelle has over there, and as a group, putting them up. This is a little bit simplified, but where they go in the process, horizontally, as well as how essential they are to get done. And so, we'll end up with a lot of cards up, forming a big map, and this is much cleaner than it will be. There would probably be some things overlapping, and in each phase there's probably not just going to be one column but many columns. But the idea is to kind of get them all up in a broad story, so it tells kind of the way the system works from end to end roughly, and what are the things that we absolutely need in order for the system to work from end to end. And then at the end of the exercise, there'll be some discussion in the middle. We'll get them all up, do some discussion in the middle, and then towards the end, what we want to do is kind of map out what is the highest priority things that will hopefully go into our first release. And again, this is much cleaner than it would look when you see photographs of this activity done in other environments. It's not a straight line across. Sometimes it jags down and includes some stories that were slightly lower priority, but we think belong in that first release because they're connected to other stories, et cetera. So, but this is kind of our goal for this afternoon. Do you guys have something to add?
There's going to be about 1,000 stories that we're going to have to put on the
No. Now, the recommendation is that you have somewhere between 60 and 120, and I think we have 80 or 90, so we're good.
I just wanted to add, too, that if any of you happen to read the article that Judy and I sent out as a recommendation, the way you select your release is you're trying to come up with a set of functionality that across the board is going to be of use to your users. So that's why sometimes it will jag down. It'll make more sense to flesh out something more deeply. But the idea is to have, in Matterhorn it'll be a little bit different, but let's say for the 6-month release, we may want to concentrate on having like a coherent set of functionality that allows a user to do a certain process end to end and not have any major missing pieces. And we'll definitely want to do that for 1.0.
Just as a short comment on what I see there, we really have to start and use a common vocabulary about the total perspective we have, because I see the prepare, capture, process, engage thing here. I see the services, design, scheduling, capture, distribution, engage thing there, and I see something else on one of the boxes. And I think that these are the large perspective, and we have to start using the same vocabulary and the same definition for these. It's okay to use it right now, but throughout the week I think we have to come up with 3 or 4 phases that we use in the same way to tell people what this system is all about. And
kind of the plan we came up with is even yet a different way. So maybe I'll throw that out. Prepare, capture, process, and engage are how it was divided in the proposal. But when we started talking about it, and we kind of started to do a little example mapping to see how it would work, we realized that probably process could be separated from distribute, and that there's also an editing phase. I don't know how people feel about that, but we can kind of come to a decision about that right now before we move on to actually working on this. Any thoughts about what it should be for the process of telling a story? So, I mean, does everybody agree that that it starts with prepare?
What does that mean? Like, prepare what?
The question, I'm trying to think of some of the user stories in prepare.
I'd say prepare common user story would be to set up a schedule for a semester's worth of recording and entering the proper metadata associated with the courses. It could also, although this is outside the scope of this project, gathering approval forms and so forth, and anything you need to do to get started on capturing.
Okay. Go ahead and take one.
Would that be so far as creating users or access and that sort of thing for classes?
Yes.
So what's actually being passed around now is in list form the user stories that we have on the cards. And again, those user stories are essentially what went into the proposal, the list that has been on the Matterhorn site or the Opencast site for a while. So I think people have some idea of what they are. We slightly rewrote some of them, but it's essentially the product scope that was that Adam put out for what we were going to accomplish in year 1. So those broke down into prepare, capture, process, and engage. And that's kind of how they're marked on there as a starting point. But I guess what I'm questioning is whether we want to change that at all. We have prepare, capture, and the idea is to think about telling a story. What is it that has to happen for our system to work from end to end? So we have to, do some setup so that the right things are scheduled for capture. We obviously have to capture. There's some processing involved, which can include editing, encoding,
indexing.
What was that?
Indexing.
Indexing, yep. then I'm gonna suggest that distribution is not part of processing, but I'm ready to cross that off. No, distribution is not part of processing. Martin is. I agree. Okay. Okay.
Is it part of engage?
I see it as separate.
I see it as separate. Too.
Okay.
Separate.
So.
Good question.
Okay. But everybody's okay with editing being potentially part of processing. I know that it's actually also part of engage, but. Okay. So.
Processing.
And just to note, you'll find in the story mapping activity that there aren't any archive user stories. And so, you know, as we go through this, we're going to find that some things are theoretically out of scope. So this is a discussion we're going to have as well as we move through the week.
I'll come back to the goals in a second. So what we're going to be doing after we take a short break, I think that'll put us right on schedule, actually. So the primary task is going to be mapping the story cards, as I just showed in that diagram, where horizontally it's where they happen in the process, and vertically by how critical they are. There are some, if you think a card is really just way too big and it should be split into smaller cards, into smaller stories, don't split them now, but you can write split. And what I'm passing out here is just some guidelines for splitting stories. So if you want to pass those around as well. You can jot down details on the card if you don't, if there's information you don't want lost, but don't use the back of the cards, because that's where, when we get to it, our acceptance tests need to be written. So everything on the front of the cards. And if you really need to, you can like stick an extra Post-it onto the back of the card to write any details. And then, so to address the issue, like for example, archiving is not in the current scope. If there is a story that you think really belongs in the current scope, you are allowed to write some new stories in addition to the ones that are already there. But think really carefully about that. Does it absolutely need to be added for Matterhorn 1.0 for our first year? So that's the kind of discussion that we'll have as we move on.
I've got a quick question about that. So one of the nice thing about us all being here and coming at it with the perspective of we don't have this system out yet is that we might come up with really interesting user stories that definitely we can't do in the first year, but that might be cool. Is there a way that we can keep these around? Because if everything goes well, we might have a second year, a further Matterhorn. And it's not only just saving us time then, but we'll never have this perspective again. We'll never have we came to it tabula rasa without something. We'll always have it, okay, well, we've done Matterhorn 1, and we'll be thinking in a way. And that might limit our vision a little bit. Is there a way that we can at least keep these stories around?
We should definitely come up with a way to do that. I'm going to kind of defer to Adam as to.
I think we were sensitive about requirement gathering because we had done requirement gathering in the past, and we didn't want people to feel like this is yet another requirement gathering activity. That being said, one of the unique circumstances which I think the service design and implementation people are in is kind of looking beyond year one if they do have the time and thinking about how the services can be defined beyond the scope of what's limited in terms of what our clients are going to be for year one. So that's one of the things that would benefit year one activities. And we also, as we noted in the past, we likely, if things go well, will be submitting another proposal possibly in the middle of our project, which is kind of unusual. So I agree with you. I would suggest that you jot that stuff down and not let it get in the way of the story mapping activity. At least from my perspective, people might have a different opinion.
Let's hear what Josh has to say.
So I'm hoping that inside of Jira, we can also capture these things. I've been working with Tony, who wasn't able to be here for this meeting, but he's going to be doing a lot of the sysadmin work for the project. And so we've got our official issues.opencastproject.org is up and running. As a side note, one of the things I want to do is make sure I get everyone here accounts, so you walk away from here with accounts, but to be able to have some kind of we call it internally a parking lot for ideas, so that these things can be kept and we don't lose them.
And one of my goals soon after this weekend would be one of my iteration 0 tasks is to structure JIRA in a way that it's evident where you guys put this stuff.
And I think even today, some people may write story cards that that get discussed, and then we say, as good as they are and as important as they seem, we need to parking lot them. We need to move them off and think about them in year 2 scope. So.
Also written questions of this question right about the story card.
Adam is saying if there are questions, if there's some lack of clarity in the way the stories are written, write those questions on the story card, and we will try and discuss them again, whether it's today or when we move on. We'll have to figure that out depending on how time is going. So just really quickly, the reason we're going to be doing the story mapping activity is, kind of the practical goal is to come up with a first approximation to be refined as the week goes on about what we want to include in our 6-month release. We want to continue, as we've been doing all day, to build this shared understanding of what our product vision is, especially for year 1. And we also want to do this prioritizing together. So the last bullet here, for purposes of this activity, we are all the product owners. This is the kind of work that's typically done by product owners, this kind of first pass at prioritizing. Today, we are all the product owners. So think with your kind of I'm representing the customers and the users hat as you do this prioritizing. What is it that they need in order to have a successful end-to-end system? And the main idea, is that across the horizontal span, you have stories that cover the entire span of business. And we will refine it even more this afternoon. So the first activity is going to be really a first rough pass done by everybody. And then kind of the people who own the teams will refine them even more. And we're going to do that today before we do that 6-month, drawing the line for the 6 months. And then we're going to continue to refine stories and the story map, or the prioritization as we go forward into release and iteration planning, which happens later in the week. So I think that's it. We're going to take a 10-minute break? Does that give us till 2:30? Okay. Okay. Well, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Yeah, Peter.
Okay. I consider us, everybody who's here, everybody who's participating in this development, also as some kind of users of this system. Supposedly, even if I just want to write like one SOA module that I want to plug into the system, I consider myself as a primal user in some way. And I think we should in some way try to focus on this, using the system, like sort of like how to interact with something that we may call the core, the backbone, the framework, or whatever, and somehow try to sort of like give a bit more focus on something like this. That's just sort of my view of the thing.
I think I switched my mic on and cut you off. Sorry about that. I just wanted to address that. On Wednesday, we're going to be focusing a lot more on this development environment proof of concept, where the rubric that I kind of had in mind was first to meet the goals of the product and what we've promised to Melon and all of that. But equally important is the development environment, how someone gets involved with the code, how they would write new services, plugging in. So for better or for worse, we've kind of split things up between functionality and developer engagement among these 2 days. So I don't know, does that address your concern that we do need to treat developers as well as users, but we've just kind of separated that out into a separate day?
So yeah, I agree totally with you. I was just wondering, sort of, can I, as a developer, contribute my user story? How do I use this sort of platform as a user in order to do development on it? So that's it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to at least collect those. I would be very interested, from my perspective, to collect those. So if you've got them, you know, maybe I don't know, maybe we can do a similar kind of exercise after Wednesday, but definitely keep them in mind and keep a list.
Yeah, I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, they don't really fit in the story of the end-to-end business need of basically getting the media out. But the kind of stories you're talking about are not about prepare, capture, process, distributor, engage, which is what we want to focus on today. So
I think Josh has a right approach. That why don't we go through Josh's workshop and see sort of where the questions lie, and some of that we may have an opportunity as we're doing the release planning to think about how those kind of stories would enter into a 6-month release plan.
yeah, I think kind of the thing about today is it's the product that we're kind of looking at. So thinking in terms of a product, I think, might help constrain what we do, because yeah, it explodes. There's a lot to be done. Okay, so 10 minutes? Okay.